Hey finger drummers. In this lesson video, I'm just gonna be going over my basic pad setup. So for the basic pad setup, I'm just going to explain and show you in order all 16 of my pads and what they're mapped to. But I just wanna make it clear that pad setup is not just one of those set it and forget it type of things. It's not something that we just set it up once and then we just always play for months and years without ever thinking about it. I've actually arrived at my pad setup. It's pretty consistent, but it's taken me years of practice and experimentation to get to a pad layout that feels good for me consistently. And I think part of it is having a logical setup. So we're gonna explain that in the next lessons after I just walk you through it. You know, having a setup that makes sense and is ergonomic and allows you to play any kind of drum beats with a lot of versatility, so you're not stuck. You never want your actual setup or basically your instrument to be inhibiting you from playing it to the highest possible capacity. So part of it is the logic, and then another part of it is a little bit of personal preference. You know, there's a lot of different highly skilled finger drummers out there who set up their pads completely differently, and that's great. You know, it allows them to do a lot of things. So the most important thing is to learn and study and absorb the logic behind my pad setup and what I recommend to you, and then experiment with it a little bit until you arrive at something that feels good for you. So with all that said, now I'm gonna walk you through my current pad layout. So I'm just gonna walk you through all the pads here. On pad 1 and on pad 5 above it, I have the same kick drum sample. Okay, so those are exactly the same. And I'll explain the reasoning behind some of these layouts, like the duplication here and why it's on 1 and 5. I'll explain that in the next videos in this category, which get into fingerings and hand positions and things like that. This isn't about the logic, this is just the setup itself. So pad 1 and 5, same kick. Pad 2 is the normal snare drum hit. It's called a snare open hit. Above that on pad 6 is the snare rim shot, which is when an acoustic drummer hits the drum with their stick, but whereas pad 2, the snare open hit, is just the sound of the stick hitting the drum head, the rim shot is when the stick comes down and hits the drum head, and at the same time, the drummer hits the rim, the metal rim of the drum with the bottom part of their stick. So it creates this really punchy, sharp sound. Pad 3 and 4 are both the exact same closed hi-hat. Pad 7 is a side stick, which is when the drummer rests the drumstick on the snare drum and just clicks the rim like that. Instead of bringing their wrist down and hitting with a part of the stick, they're resting the stick, the base of the stick, on the drum head, and they're clicking against the rim. So it sounds like this. Pad 8 is the open hi-hat. And it's important to note that your closed hi-hats should always choke your open hi-hat, which simply means that whenever this is being played, this open hi-hat sample, if the closed hi-hats are hit while this is still being played, they will cut it off, which is exactly how a real acoustic set of hi-hats works, because when they're open, that means they're loose. And if a drummer suddenly decides to play it closed, he's clamping down on the hi-hat and therefore cutting off the open sound. Now, pads 9 through 12 are all toms, from high to low. So this is the highest, the middle, lower, and the lowest tom. Pad 13 is a crash, pan to the left. Pad 14 is a crash pan to the right. Pad 15 is the ride cymbal. And pad 16 is the bell of the ride cymbal. So that's it. That's my entire 16 pad setup. I pretty much have it the same almost all the time. There are some times where I'll switch it up and experiment, and I encourage you to do that too. You can copy along this exact setup for right now, and in the next lessons, I'll explain the logic behind this, the different fingerings that you can use. And I always encourage you to think about your setup logically and always experiment. Maybe, you know, after a few weeks of playing, you'll feel like, I'd like to try changing this thing or doing a different fingering, you know, that Dragon hasn't talked about, and that's totally okay. Finger drumming is an art form that's still being developed. So, we need to keep experimenting and pushing our standards, but it is good to have a logical standard setup that most people can start with. And in the next videos in this category, I'll explain why.